basic theme of the ages of globalization is the importance of the world as a interconnected society facing up to global scale challenges. And of course, we focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and on the challenge of stopping the human-induced climate change and on the global scale challenge of protecting biodiversity. So we are living in an age where the cooperation across nations at a global scale is absolutely fundamental. And one would think that all the nations would get it, and in a way, they do. Our governments have indeed signed some crucial agreements like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, and like the adoption of the 2030 Agenda with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So we do have processes of multilateralism, in other words, of governments cooperating with each other. We do, of course, have the United Nations as the foundational institution to support multilateralism and to support international cooperation. And in this class, I want us to focus on a pretty interesting and not so self-evident fact, and that is that international cooperation is relatively new. Of course, nations or empires have had ways to cooperate with each other in the past. Neighboring countries have signed peace agreements or have settled conflicts through treaties. But global scale cooperation, in which all the nations of the world join together in a process of international law to govern relations at the global scale, is a new phenomenon. And it is a phenomenon that in our day is centered at the United Nations and its headquarters in New York, as well as the dozens of UN institutions all over the world, including specialized agencies like the World Health Organization or the International Telecommunications Union or UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization based in Paris, that is our means of achieving international cooperation. For this class, I want us to appreciate how new this entire concept is of international cooperation and international rule of law, and how hard it is, because it's not simple to get what are now 193 UN member states to cooperate with each other and to follow through on agreements that have been reached. Well, perhaps one sign of the fact that international cooperation is new is the fact that the word international is only a little bit more than 2 centuries old. It's an invented modern world. It's an invented modern word. It's a word that was invented by the activist and philosopher Jeremy Bentham in England. And it was a term that first went into use basically at the start of the 19th century, where Bentham talked about the relations between nations, international. And that by itself shows that what seems necessarily to have been a permanent feature of humanity is really something very new. We're just getting started. But we had better hurry, because our global challenges are so serious, so profound, that we don't have time to lose. We can't experiment for the next few centuries because we'll lose the time to solve crucial problems and even to keep the peace. So what do I want us to appreciate and understand in this class? First, I want us to understand the history of even the concept of global scale cooperation and global peace. I date it back to the prophets, the Hebrew Bible, and the prophet Isaiah, who gave one of the first and the most vivid and wondrous and poetic visions of global scale cooperation and peace. And it is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, where the poet and prophet, Isaiah says that they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And not only is this such a remarkable vision, it is literally the inscription on the wall across the street of First Avenue, just opposite the United Nations. So it is called Isaiah's Wall, and there is this great verse that gives the inspiration for having a United Nations. Well, that was prophesied perhaps 2,800 years ago. It did not come to pass till today, that nation shall not lift up sword against nation. We continue to have wars raging around the world. But leading thinkers and philosophers did not give up the dream of creating the means to peace on the planet. And a notable next moment of thought, it's a long gap between Isaiah and the Enlightenment in Europe, but a next pivotal moment for me is the essay written in 1795 by the great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, called Perpetual Peace. And Immanuel Kant, for the first time, lays out not just a prophecy or a poetic vision, but actually almost a charter for how perpetual peace could be made among the nations of the world. And he puts forward, and you will read these precepts and principles to guide the behavior of nations so that they won't make war on each other. And we remember that remarkable essay, Perpetual Peace, almost 230 years later, as being, again, a remarkable vision for how in a world of independent nations, we could still arrive at an international rule of law. Well, Immanuel Kant was writing in the first years of the Napoleonic Wars, which in fact would stretch across Europe until 1815 and cause untold destruction and loss of life. And in 1815, the wars finally came to an end, and the powers of Europe that had defeated Napoleon tried to create a practical system that became known as the Concert of Europe, in which the major powers would collectively try to promote peace on a multilateral basis. And this Congress system, or Vienna system, was based on the idea of a balance of power among the major countries of Europe, of Britain, of the Habsburg Empire, of the new rising Prussian Empire, of France, and of other parts, and of course of Russia, I should emphasize the Russian Empire of the Romanovs. And the idea of the Concert of Europe was that these major powers would work together collectively to try to promote the peace. Very complicated story. They had some success, but it was a very conservative group of nations as well that aimed not only to preserve the peace, but to preserve the power of the monarchs or of the emperors, as opposed to the rising calls for power for the people through democratic institutions. So the Concert of Europe had some successes, but it also resisted democratization in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. And in the second half of the 19th century, Europe had plenty of wars, and very brutal wars. The Crimean War, which pitted France and Britain against Russia. The Balkan Wars of the late 1870s. The wars of German unification and the wars that gave rise to Italy's unification and creation as a modern nation state. Plenty of war. The Concert of Europe still operated, but in a very fragile and limited way. And by the end of the 19th century, Europe was characterized more by an arms race between Germany and Britain and competition between the major powers than it was by a balance of power or by a collective security process. One of the things, ironically and astoundingly in retrospect, the European powers tried to do was to cooperate in a very civil way as they brutally divided up the rest of the world. So in the Congress of Berlin in 1885, the European powers came together and pored over maps of how they would carve up Africa as European colonial possessions. Very polite within Europe, very brutal in Europe's relations with Africa. Well, peace did not hold ultimately, as we know. Not only were there the regional wars continuing in the Balkans, but then the outbreak of a disastrous civilizational war in 1914. And World War I, or known at the time not as one because they didn't know that two was going to come, but as the Great War, was a catastrophic event for European civilization, and one that reverberates until today, with millions of lives lost, with the end of various empires, with the emergence of profound and continuing instability in many places of Europe, with economic and financial distress that ultimately tipped over into a Great Depression in the 1930s, and which ultimately gave rise to yet another Great War, and by great only in scale, one of the disasters of all of human history, World War II. At the end of World War I, political leaders said, my God, we failed. The Concert of Europe failed. Immanuel Kant's vision of perpetual peace failed. Isaiah's prophecy has failed. We must take measures to create institutions for peace. And what emerged was the new League of Nations, based in Geneva in 1920, to be a new institution for international peace and multilateralism. Alas, the United States, which would become the predominant power in the second half of the 20th century, but was already a major economic power by 1920, refused to join, even though the original idea of the League of Nations had been pushed by President Woodrow Wilson. So the League of Nations was already born with a major weakness that the United States was not a party to it, and it failed institutionally in preventing new wars of the 1930s, and then ultimately failing catastrophically in preventing the arrival of World War II in 1939. In the midst of World War II, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt conceived of a successor institution to the League of Nations, one the United States would not only join, but effectively would lead in its creation and its early years. And that, of course, is the United Nations. From 1945 onward, the nations of the world have at least aspired to live under rule of law as defined by the United Nations Charter and under universal ethical principles as defined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN member states in 1948. So the UN is our hope today, our global institution that aims to fulfill what is almost an age-old dream of global peace, a dream in which nation shall not lift up sword against nation. And our course is in a fundamental way a course in support of the vision of the United Nations, of the vision of global peace and cooperation, of the vision of worldwide sustainable development, of a vision of fulfillment of what our governments have proclaimed, what they have signed, what they have declared to be their aspiration in terms of rule of law, human rights, and sustainable development.